Hey guys, greetings from New York City.
Hi there. Well, today we're going to be talking about engaging the system and peripheral actors. In other words, those that are outside of our company, let's say. We're going to be talking about those peripheral actors, something called greenwashing, and the social license to operate. So let's get started. We're going to be exploring how politics, values, expectations play a role in your ability to get projects done. We're also going to be talking about something called greenwashing, which has to do with sustainability and the perception of sustainability, but it may or may not be what the company is actually doing. So, we're going to talk about how all these issues interrelate and how they relate to both sustainability and your ability to develop and maintain successful projects. People, I've found, are often the forgotten component in technological systems. The people in the system, those that, whatever the infrastructure system is, will be most directly impacted, are often an afterthought in planning projects. Or even worse, they're seen as a bother or a nuisance or are not seen at all. And this can result in a lot of unforeseen consequences, ranging from failures of projects all the way to literal violence. So, one thing we want to be thinking about is values. Values means what's important to people at the bottom line. Values are changing, and thus behaviors are also changing. There's more concern now in the world about marginalized communities, about things that are being done to communities that maybe are underserved or low income, for example, pollution in lower income communities. There's more focus on that and something called environmental justice. We'll talk a little bit more about that in a future lesson. But there's also changing values amongst young people, notably around the environment. 7 out of 10 young people aged 7 through 12 now are worried about the climate crisis. That's the majority of young people. And many young people are suffering something called climate anxiety. And they are actually having anxiety about climate change and about where things are going. And they're changing their behaviors, they're changing their buying patterns, their eating patterns to try to do something about it. So, how do companies address this zeitgeist, this atmosphere of changing values toward a green orientation amongst consumers? And the answer for some is to fake it. So, let's talk about greenwashing. What is greenwashing? Greenwashing is the practice of making false or misleading claims about the environmental benefits of a product, service, or company. It's also this idea that companies are sort of misrepresenting what they're doing or minimizing the harm that they may be doing against the environment. Greenwashing is often used as a kind of marketing tactic to make the company or product appear more environmentally friendly than it actually is. It's kind of a fake it till you'll make it approach to sustainability. So, what are the drivers of greenwashing? Well, according to Delmas and Burbano, there are several drivers at work here that encourage this kind of unethical behavior. And these include a desire to gain a competitive advantage in the marketplace, a lack of regulation or enforcement of environmental claims, pressures to meet stakeholder expectations, and a lack of transparency in supply chains. So let's delve a little bit deeper into this idea of values and peripheral actors and behaviors to look at the inner dimensions of sustainability. In terms of the inner dimension of sustainability, L.G. Horlings argues that personal and cultural values play a significant role in determining how individuals and societies approach sustainability. So, understanding these values can help us to better understand and address sustainability challenges and potential challenges to our projects we are trying to develop. So let's delve a little deeper into personal and cultural values. What does that mean? Personal and cultural values can greatly influence how individuals and societies approach sustainability. Personal values are the principles, beliefs, and standards that guide an individual's actions and decisions. These values can be shaped by a variety of factors, including things like upbringing, education, and personal experiences. Cultural values, on the other hand, are the shared beliefs, customs, and behaviors that are characteristics of a community or particular group or society. These values can be influenced by factors like geography, history, and religion. Personal and cultural values are important because they can play a significant role in determining how individuals and societies approach sustainability, because they can also shape attitudes and behaviors towards things like environmental protection, resource conservation, and social justice. For example, if an individual values environmental conservation and social justice, they may be more likely to support sustainability initiatives such as renewable energy, conservation efforts, and community development projects. On the other hand, if an individual values economic growth and individual success, they may be more likely to prioritize economic development over environmental and social concerns. So you can see how these kinds of pro-environment, pro-development, pro-economic growth, these can be clashing values. And we saw a case of this up in the Arctic area, up in Alaska, where Republicans enacted legislation to mandate two major leases for oil drilling in a very environmentally sensitive region of Alaska. And that was supposed to be enacted by 2024. Yet groups of indigenous people and coupled with environmental groups launched a campaign to pressure corporations against developing in the area. So you've got, again, pro-economic development coming into clash with local indigenous people and environmental groups. And what ended up happening in 2022 is that the oil companies exited their leases and are not going to drill in this particular Arctic refuge. So, people invest a lot of money to get projects going, and if they don't get the social license to operate by understanding and getting an agreement with local people, the projects can come to a quick end. So, what you want to do is understand stakeholder values. That's really key. Understand and consider the role that personal and cultural values play in shaping the local community's approach to sustainability. By understanding these values and how they might influence behavior and attitudes, individuals and societies and companies can work together toward a more sustainable future. So, what we're really talking about here, as we talk about peripheral actors to the system, is we're talking about understanding the context in which you are developing or doing business or trying to develop infrastructure. And you want to also think about the geopolitical factors at play or the regime type that is in place in the area that you are talking about going into. Stephen Worster talks about this. He explores the relationship between regime type, be it democratic or autocratic, and sustainable development. And he argues that democracies may be more effective at promoting sustainable development due to greater accountability and transparency. And sometimes you're going to have a choice about what kind of regime your project might be under. So, for example, I know some of the fellows that are developing the subsea cable networks for our communication technologies. And they have decisions to make whether to land in Hong Kong or to land in Guam, for example, and they think about what kinds of factors, who they might be working with politically as they make the decisions about where they're going to develop, where they're going to land their cables. So, this is another aspect of thinking about the context and whether that context is going to allow you to develop the kind of infrastructure that you want to develop. Ian Scoons is another who talks about power, politics, and sustainable development and how these factors may shape your development efforts. So he's arguing that it's so important to understand these kinds of power dynamics, political dynamics at play, and whether they will be pro sustainable development or will impede you, possibly even in the future, with what you're trying to accomplish. One good example of this, of the way that political and economic interests can shape policies, are those related to natural resource management. For example, in many developing countries, large multinational corporations might have significant political influence to push for resource extraction policies that prioritize their own profits over sustainable development for local communities. And this can lead to the degradation of natural resources and can negatively impact local communities and their livelihoods. For example, Scoons argues that in order to promote truly sustainable development in these contexts, It's necessary to understand and address these kinds of power dynamics and the ways that they shape policy decisions. This might mean empowering local communities and other peripheral actors to have a greater say in natural resource management decisions and ensuring that their needs and their perspectives and their cultural values are taken into account. Cannot underscore how important this idea is. So let's talk about what the umbrella term here is. And what we're going for is something called the social license to operate. Now, Moffat, Lacey, Zhang, and Leopold talk about this, and they define this as the perceived legitimacy of an organization to operate within a community. Now, I want to note that this isn't an actual license like a driver's license or a building permit. This is the social approval that the company receives from local stakeholders to build or develop or mine or otherwise harvest local resources, etc. They argue that organizations must consider the social and environmental impacts of their operations and work to maintain a positive relationship with their stakeholders in order to maintain that social license to operate. Which begs the questions, who are these stakeholders? And that's important to consider. Really think through who is going to be impacted by this project that you're trying to do. So what's the importance of the social license to operate? Maintaining this social license to operate is important for organizations because it can do several things. One, it can affect their ability to secure and maintain operating licenses and permits. Second, it can influence their ability to access capital and other resources. And third, it can affect their reputation and relationships with stakeholders. So the failure to acquire the social license to operate can end in significant brand damage. And in a world where everybody's connected and word can travel fast via social media, it's more important than ever before to gain the local community's social license to operate. So, what are some of the factors that can affect the social license to operate? Let's think about that and some of the examples of not getting the social license to operate. So, some of the factors that can affect the social license to operate include the organization's track record on environmental and social issues, the transparency and communication of the organization, and the extent to which the organization engages with and responds to stakeholder concerns. So let's think of some examples of not getting the social license to operate. The proposed Pebble mine in Alaska was one of them. The proposed Pebble mine would have extracted copper and gold from beneath a large salmon-producing watershed. The proposed mine faced significant opposition from local communities and environmental groups who argued that it would have a devastating impact on the region's fishing and tourism industries. Eventually, the project was withdrawn by the company due to the social license to operate not being obtained because of a lack of support from the local population. The Belo Monte Dam in Brazil is another example. The dam was proposed to be built on the Xingu River. It faced significant opposition, though, from local indigenous communities and environmental groups who argued that it would displace thousands of people and have a devastating impact on the region's ecosystem. Yet, despite the opposition, the dam was built anyway, but it's still facing legal and social challenges with a negative impact on the company's longer term social license to operate. The Cerrejón mine in Colombia is another example. The Cerrejón mine in Colombia is one of the largest open pit coal mines in the world. The mine faced significant opposition from local communities and environmental groups who argued that it led to the displacement of thousands of people and would have a devastating impact on the region's ecosystem. The company's been facing legal and social challenges, and the mining operations have been protested by the local population, negatively affecting the social license to operate. Another is the proposed gold mine in the Nyamgiri Hills, India region by Vedanta Resources. This proposed gold mine faced significant opposition from local communities who argued that the mine would have a devastating impact on the region's environment and the livelihoods of local tribes. The company's attempt to gain the social license to operate failed, and the project was ultimately abandoned due to the significant opposition. So gaining the social license to operate is, is key to the success of any of these kinds of infrastructure projects. Personal and cultural values can play a significant role in shaping an organization's social license to operate. Organizations must also consider and address the values of stakeholders in order to maintain that social license to operate. Greenwashing, which we mentioned before, can impact this social license to operate. It can undermine an organization's social license if they're making false or misleading claims about the environmental impacts of their operations. So it's very important for organizations to be both transparent and honest about the environmental impacts in order to maintain that social license to operate within the local community. The role of politics is also important in the social license to operate. You want to think about the role of relationships with local and larger scale regulators, governmental representatives, and policymakers, because politics can shape an organization's social license to operate, including via regulatory environments in which the organization operates, including by the extent to which the organization is able to influence policy and decision-making processes, and the influence of lobby groups and other stakeholders on the organization's ability to get projects done. So sometimes we talk about education and outreach for the local community, but sometimes you also have to do education and outreach with governmental representatives who might not understand the technology, who might not understand the benefits or the jobs created, for example, by what you're trying to do. So don't neglect that education and outreach piece to local and larger scale governmental representatives. So, what are a few strategies in addition to this that you can undertake for maintaining your social license to operate in a community? Well, there's several. One, engage in meaningful consultation and dialogue with stakeholders. Bring in community leaders. They can be religious leaders, they can be business leaders, local representatives of political groups, for example, or city council members, etc., etc. Have a dialogue with these people, involve them, hear their thoughts, hear their concerns, so you can address them. Be transparent and accountable in your processes, in your operations, and your decision making process. And demonstrate commitment to the environment and social responsibility through both your actions and initiatives. So, a couple of case studies of companies that have done a good job and companies that have done a bad job at this. A company that's done a great job that we can learn from, I think, is Patagonia. Patagonia is a clothing and outdoor gear company, but they've had a long history of environmental and social activism, and they've consistently engaged in meaningful consultation with stakeholders, including employees, customers, and environmental groups. The company's implemented a range of initiatives to minimize its environmental impact, including using sustainable materials in its products, reducing waste in its supply chain, and supporting environmental conservation efforts. Through these kinds of efforts and initiatives, Patagonia has been able to maintain a positive reputation and a strong social license to operate, and has continued to grow and succeed as a company. On the other hand, is BP. BP is an example of a company that struggled to maintain its social license to operate due to a lack of transparency and a history of environmental and social violations. BP is a multinational oil and gas company, and they face significant criticism and backlash due to a number of environmental and social incidents, including the Deepwater Horizon oil spill in 2010, which resulted in the largest offshore oil spill in U.S. history. And there's some video you can take a look at probably on YouTube of their CEO saying that, this was interrupting his golf game or something. Like basically, this was a big pain in his neck when you've got oil spilling into a region that's heavy in fishing and a region that relies upon the sea for its livelihood. And people were furious when they heard the way that this executive was talking. The company has also faced accusations of greenwashing and a lack of transparency in operations, including in its management of environmental risks and impacts. So, as a result of this, BP has struggled to maintain its social license to operate. And, it's really difficult. Once you've lost or broken the public trust, it's very hard to get back on track. Even though they've improved environmental and social performance and they're trying to communicate with the community, they've lost credibility in this area. So people don't trust them. And it's very, very hard to get that back once broken. So, lastly, let's talk about the role of government and policy in the social license to operate. Governmental policies and regulations can have a big impact on an organization's social license to operate because they set the standards for environmental and social performance. Governments can also play a role in promoting transparency and accountability in the operations of organizations. Civil society can also play an important role. NGOs and community groups can hold organizations accountable for their environmental and social impacts, and they can influence that social license to operate. One example is Greenpeace. NGOs and community groups can also advocate for policies and regulations that promote sustainable development. So, in conclusion, the social license to operate is an important concept for organizations to consider in order to maintain their legitimacy and credibility within the communities that they operate in. Maintaining that social license to operate requires considering and addressing the values, concerns, and expectations of stakeholders, as well as being transparent and accountable in operations and decision-making processes. Environmental and sustainability concerns are becoming more and more important amongst shareholders and amongst consumers, particularly younger consumers. So ethical behavior in terms of sustainable development is going to be more important than ever on the horizon to maintain that social license to operate. So let's discuss this, and I look forward to hearing your ideas about this in class. Thanks for being with us.